The snickers started quietly at first, then grew louder as the elderly man made his way down the airplane aisle. Passengers whispered and pointed at his faded military jacket, its worn patches and frayed edges a target for cruel jokes. "Look at that old coat," a businessman sneered, nudging his neighbor. Someone should tell him the 1970s ended decades ago. Phones were pulled out to capture the moment, and laughter rippled through the cabin like a wildfire sparked by ignorance and arrogance. But flight attendant Sarah Martinez felt a sudden chill as her eyes caught on a particular patch on the veteran's jacket. Her breath hitched, and her hands trembled as she leaned closer to read the words that transformed the entire scene. Prisoner of war. Vietnam, 1968 to 1973. 5 long years. Years of torment, deprivation, and horrors too awful to imagine. The cruel mockery that had filled the cabin just moments ago suddenly felt like a dark stain on every face that had laughed. Sarah's voice caught as she gently approached the old man, tears threatening to spill as she realized the depth of his sacrifice. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence filled with shame and reverence. Passengers lowered their heads, some wiping away unexpected tears, as the true weight of the man's story settled over the cabin like a solemn vow never to forget. In that moment, the flight became more than just a journey. It became a powerful reminder that behind every worn uniform lies a story of courage, pain, and resilience, demanding respect beyond words. Welcome to Echoes of Honor, where we discover that the clothes don't make the man, the sacrifices do. Before we continue this powerful story about judgment, respect, and the veterans whose suffering bought our freedom, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe these stories about military sacrifice and overcoming cruelty deserve to be shared, please hit that subscribe button to join our growing community. Your support helps us honor those who endured the unthinkable. American Airlines Flight 1634 from Los Angeles to Miami was packed with 284 passengers on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in September. The Boeing 777 hummed with the typical energy of a cross-country flight filled with business travelers, vacationers, and people traveling for family obligations. The mood in the cabin was generally upbeat, with passengers settling in for the 5-hour journey with books, tablets, and the casual conversations that fill aircraft during boarding. The first-class section buzzed with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to premium treatment, while the economy cabin filled with the resigned acceptance of travelers who had learned to make the best of cramped quarters and limited legroom. Overhead bins slammed shut as passengers claimed their territory and prepared for another routine flight across the American continent. Into this ordinary scene walked Master Sergeant Daniel Murphy. Though none of the passengers who turned to stare at him knew his name or the extraordinary story written in the fabric of the jacket that had captured their mocking attention. At 74, Daniel moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been broken and rebuilt more times than medical science should have allowed, each step a small victory over injuries that should have killed him decades earlier. The jacket that drew such cruel attention was indeed old, its olive drab fabric faded from years of wear and washing. The patches sewn onto its surface told a story that Daniel preferred not to discuss, markers of service and sacrifice that meant everything to him and nothing to the passengers who saw only outdated fashion and assumed poverty. The leather had cracked along the elbows, the zippers stuck occasionally, and the overall appearance suggested someone who either couldn't afford new clothes or was too stubborn to let go of outdated style. What the laughing passengers couldn't see, what their surface judgments prevented them from understanding, was that Daniel's jacket was more than clothing. It was a memorial, a museum, a testament to experiences that had tested every aspect of human endurance and emerged with dignity intact. Each patch represented not just military service, but survival against odds that most people couldn't comprehend. Sarah Martinez had been working as a flight attendant for Delta Airlines for 6 years, long enough to develop professional efficiency, but still young enough to maintain genuine empathy for the passengers she served. At 31, she approached her job with a combination of competence and compassion that had earned her recognition from supervisors and gratitude from travelers who appreciated being treated as individuals rather than problems to be managed. Her own family background had given her a deep respect for military service and an understanding of the sacrifices made by veterans and their families. Her grandfather had served in World War II, her uncle had been wounded in Vietnam, and her brother was currently deployed with the army in Afghanistan. These personal connections had taught her to look beyond surface appearances and to recognize the signs of military service that others might miss. As Daniel made his way down the aisle toward his seat in row 28, the mockery began almost immediately. The contrast between his worn military jacket and the designer clothing of many passengers made him an easy target for people who confused expensive fashion with personal worth and assumed that anyone wearing old clothes was fair game for ridicule. A young executive in an expensive suit whispered loudly to his colleague, "Someone should tell Grandpa that Army surplus stores sell more than just old jackets." His comment sparked laughter from nearby passengers who were pleased to have someone to look down on, someone whose appearance made them feel superior and fashionable by comparison. A group of college students returning from a West Coast conference began taking photos of Daniel's jacket, planning to share them on social media with captions about fashion disasters and what not to wear on airplanes. Their behavior reflected the casual cruelty that social media had normalized, where mocking strangers had become entertainment and public humiliation was considered harmless fun. Even some of the more mature passengers joined in the judgment, though their mockery was more subtle. Disapproving looks, whispered comments to travel companions, and the kind of head-shaking that suggested they considered Daniel's appearance a personal affront to the standards of proper air travel behavior. The irony was profound, though none of the mocking passengers understood it. They were traveling freely across the American continent, protected by the security and stability that Daniel's generation had provided through their service and sacrifice. Their ability to mock military veterans was itself a privilege that had been earned by people willing to endure experiences that most Americans could barely imagine. Daniel's response to the mockery was characteristic of the dignity he had maintained throughout his life. He neither acknowledged the comments nor responded to the laughter. He had learned long ago that some people's opinions weren't worth the energy required to correct them, that dignity was something you maintained internally rather than something you demanded from others. But Sarah Martinez noticed everything. Her position as a flight attendant gave her a unique perspective on passenger behavior, and her family background made her sensitive to the way military veterans were sometimes treated by people who had never experienced the realities of military service. She watched the mockery with growing disgust and a building determination to intervene if it continued. As Daniel reached his assigned seat and began the careful process of stowing his carry-on bag, Sarah moved closer to observe the patches on his jacket more carefully. Her grandfather had taught her to read military insignia and decorations, and she recognized several markers of distinguished service that the mocking passengers had completely missed. Then she saw the patch that changed everything. A small rectangular piece of fabric sewn near the left shoulder that carried words that made her blood freeze. Prisoner of war. Vietnam, 1968 to 1973. 5 years. 5 years of captivity, torture, starvation, and psychological warfare that had broken many men, but had somehow left Daniel with enough strength to survive and enough dignity to endure the mockery of people who had never faced a challenge greater than a delayed flight or an uncomfortable seat. Sarah's hands began trembling as she processed the full significance of what she was reading. The patch that identified Daniel as a prisoner of war wasn't just a military decoration. It was evidence of suffering that most people couldn't comprehend, survival against odds that defied medical and psychological understanding, and courage that had been tested under conditions designed to break human beings completely. The dates on the patch told a story of unimaginable endurance. 1968 to 1973. 5 years in enemy captivity during one of the most brutal conflicts in American history. 5 years when Daniel had been cut off from family, friends, medical care, adequate food, and any hope of rescue or release. 5 years when his survival had depended on inner strength that most people never have to discover they possess. Sarah's knowledge of Vietnam War history, gained through her uncle's stories and her own research into military service, gave her context for understanding what those 5 years had meant. Prisoner of war camps in Vietnam had been designed not just to contain captured Americans, but to break them psychologically and physically. Torture, starvation, disease, isolation, and constant psychological pressure had been used systematically to destroy the will and dignity of captured servicemen. The fact that Daniel had survived those 5 years, had returned to rebuild his life, and was now enduring the mockery of passengers who owed their freedom to his sacrifice, filled Sarah with a mixture of rage and profound sadness. The worn jacket that passengers were ridiculing wasn't a fashion choice. It was a memorial to experiences that had earned him the right to be treated with the highest respect. Without hesitation, Sarah approached the nearest group of passengers who had been participating in the mockery, her voice carrying an authority that immediately commanded their attention. "Excuse me, but I need you to understand something about the gentleman you've been laughing at." The young executive who had made the comment about army surplus stores looked up with mild annoyance, clearly irritated that a flight attendant was interrupting what he considered harmless entertainment. "What's the problem? We're just having a little fun." Sarah's response carried the weight of someone whose family had experienced the realities of military service and who understood the cost of the freedom that allowed passengers to travel safely and mock veterans without consequence. "That jacket you're laughing at belongs to a prisoner of war who spent 5 years in Vietnamese captivity. The patches you think are outdated fashion choices are actually decorations that represent 5 years of torture and suffering." The transformation in the passengers' faces was immediate and dramatic. The laughter died instantly as they began to understand that their entertainment had come at the expense of someone whose suffering had been beyond their comprehension. The young executive's smirk disappeared as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. Sarah continued, her voice carrying throughout the surrounding rows as other passengers turned to listen. "Master Sergeant Murphy was captured in 1968 and held prisoner until 1973. For 5 years, he endured conditions that were designed to break him physically and mentally. He survived so that all of you could fly safely across the country and mock the very symbol of his service." The impact of Sarah's words rippled through the cabin as passengers throughout the aircraft began to understand what they had witnessed. The college students who had been taking photos deleted them immediately, their social media mockery suddenly seeming not just inappropriate, but deeply shameful. The businessman who had suggested Daniel needed fashion advice felt sick as he realized he had been ridiculing someone whose sacrifices had protected his freedom to travel and conduct business safely. Sarah's own emotions overwhelmed her as she continued to speak, tears beginning to flow as she thought about her uncle's experiences in Vietnam and the stories he had shared about prisoners of war who had never returned home. 5 years of torture, 5 years of starvation, 5 years of not knowing if he would ever see his family again. And you thought his jacket was funny. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation was profound and uncomfortable, the kind of silence that comes when people are forced to confront the ugliness of their own behavior and the reality of sacrifices they had never considered. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had participated in or witnessed the mockery felt the weight of shame as they understood that their entertainment had come at the expense of someone who deserved their highest respect. Daniel, who had been quietly settling into his seat while trying to ignore the ongoing comments about his appearance, suddenly found himself the focus of a very different kind of attention. Passengers throughout the surrounding rows were turning to look at him not with mockery, but with the kind of respect and reverence that comes from understanding the true measure of heroism and sacrifice. Sarah approached Daniel's seat with tears still flowing, her voice barely controlled as she tried to find words adequate to the moment. "Master Sergeant Murphy, I want to apologize on behalf of everyone aboard this aircraft for the way you've been treated. Your service and sacrifice deserve our highest respect, not our mockery." Daniel's response was characteristic of the grace and humility that had carried him through 5 years of captivity and decades of civilian life afterward. "Miss, you don't need to apologize for other people's behavior. I've learned that some folks just don't understand what military service means. That's okay. I didn't serve for recognition or respect. I served because it was my duty." But Sarah was not going to let the moment pass without ensuring that Daniel received the recognition he deserved and that the passengers who had mocked him understood the magnitude of their mistake. "Sir, would you allow me to tell the other passengers about your service? I think they need to understand who you are and what you've sacrificed for all of us." Daniel's initial reluctance was overcome by Sarah's obvious sincerity and her genuine desire to educate rather than embarrass the passengers who had treated him poorly. If you think it will help people understand military service better, then I suppose that would be okay. Sarah moved to the aircraft's public address system and made an announcement that would be remembered by every passenger aboard Flight 1634 for the rest of their lives. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to Master Sergeant Daniel Murphy, who is seated in row 28. Master Sergeant Murphy served our country with distinction in Vietnam, where he was captured in 1968 and held as a prisoner of war for 5 years. The impact of Sarah's announcement was immediate and dramatic. Passengers throughout the aircraft turned to look at Daniel with expressions that had been completely transformed from mockery to respect. The young executive who had made jokes about Army surplus stores stood up in his seat, his face flushed with shame as he realized the magnitude of his insensitivity. Sarah continued, her voice carrying the emotion of someone who understood the personal cost of military service through her own family's experiences. For 5 years, Master Sergeant Murphy endured torture, starvation, and psychological warfare in Vietnamese prison camps. He survived conditions that were designed to break him, and he returned home to rebuild his life and continue serving others. The spontaneous applause that began in the front of the aircraft quickly spread throughout the cabin as passengers stood to honor someone whose suffering had protected their freedom to travel safely and live without fear of foreign invasion or oppression. The ovation continued for several minutes, with passengers in every section of the aircraft participating in recognition of Daniel's extraordinary service and sacrifice. The college students who had been taking photos for social media mockery now asked permission to take pictures with Daniel to share stories about meeting a genuine American hero. The businessman who had commented about outdated fashion spent the remainder of the flight learning about Daniel's experiences and expressing gratitude for sacrifices he had never previously considered. During the flight, Daniel shared selected stories from his military service and his years as a prisoner of war, describing the conditions in Vietnamese camps and the inner strength that had enabled him to survive when many others had not. His stories revealed not just the physical hardships of captivity, but the psychological warfare that had been designed to break prisoners' spirits and turn them against their own country. The worn jacket that had triggered such cruel mockery became a symbol of endurance, survival, and dignity maintained under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Each patch told a story of service and sacrifice that commanded respect rather than ridicule, representing experiences that most people could barely comprehend. The conversation also revealed the lasting impact of Daniel's military service on his post-war life. After his release and recovery, he had worked for 30 years as a counselor, helping other veterans deal with the psychological aftermath of combat and captivity. His own experiences had given him unique insights into survival and recovery that had helped countless other veterans rebuild their lives. When Flight 1634 landed in Miami, Daniel was given the honor of being the first passenger to deplane, not as compensation for the mockery he had endured, but as recognition of his extraordinary service to his country. Every passenger aboard the aircraft made a point of expressing their gratitude and apologizing for the assumptions and judgments that had led to his initial treatment. The young executive who had made the cruelest comments spent several minutes speaking with Daniel, sharing his own family's military history and expressing profound regret for his behavior. Master Sergeant Murphy, I have no excuse for my comments. My own grandfather served in World War II, and I should have recognized the signs of military service. I'm deeply ashamed of my behavior. Sarah Martinez's intervention had transformed what began as a display of casual cruelty into a powerful lesson about respect, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes who walk among us every day. Her willingness to confront mockery and educate passengers about the reality of military service had created one of the most meaningful experiences of her career. The patches on Daniel's jacket that had been ridiculed as outdated fashion choices were revealed as markers of experiences that defined the very best of American military service. The prisoner of war patch that had brought Sarah to tears represented not just individual survival, but the collective sacrifice of all Americans who have endured captivity so that others could remain free. In the weeks following the flight, several passengers reached out to veterans organizations to learn more about prisoner of war experiences and to volunteer their time supporting veterans who had endured similar hardships. The mockery that had seemed so harmless had been revealed as profoundly hurtful behavior directed at someone who deserved the highest respect. Daniel's worn military jacket became a symbol of dignity maintained under impossible conditions, of service that continued long after official duty had ended, and of the inner strength that enables some people to endure experiences that would destroy others. The ridicule it had attracted reflected the ignorance of people who confused material appearance with personal worth and who failed to recognize the signs of extraordinary sacrifice. The transformation of passenger attitudes from mockery to respect demonstrated the power of education and understanding to overcome prejudice and ignorance. Sarah Martinez's courage in confronting cruel behavior and her knowledge of military service had created an opportunity for learning that would influence every passenger aboard Flight 1634 for years to come. Sometimes the most important lessons come disguised as uncomfortable confrontations with our own prejudices and assumptions. The passengers who had mocked Daniel Murphy's jacket had learned that appearances can be deceiving, that heroism often wears humble clothing, and that the freedom to ridicule veterans is itself a privilege that has been earned through sacrifices most people will never be asked to make. The 5 years that Daniel had spent in Vietnamese prison camps had ended decades earlier, but his story continued to teach and inspire people who encountered him throughout his civilian life. His dignity in the face of mockery, his willingness to educate rather than condemn, and his continued service to fellow veterans represented the highest ideals of military service extending far beyond official duty. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who was mocked or ridiculed because others failed to understand their sacrifices? Tell us in the comments about the veterans in your life who have faced ignorance with dignity, and how their example has taught you about true strength. And if you think stories like these about overcoming cruelty and honoring military sacrifice need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.